If you were...
When I see a theme of a conference, and I read the narrative for this theme, I look for things that I might provoke. In this particular case, it's the adverb cybernetically that I wanted to unpack. And short paper I wrote there, some copies that have been around, and there might be one or two left. If you want one, and there are no more left, just give me your email address and I'll send you one. Because I'm not going to talk about it. What you just saw going by there, that was the paper. This is what I added this morning. What I wanted to do was take the opportunity that at least I had, and I think that we had, with Klaus Krippendorf here with us. As many of you know, thinking has been one of the themes that I like to advance in cybernetic meetings, in my writing. Not thinking divorced from language, these go together very much, but still something separate from language. And this has an origin in my own history, going back to when I was a kid and realizing that I was at times actually that was being talked about as thinking. And I like it. I like doing it. I like describing myself that way, and I continue to do so. So I've been sort of stubborn about continuing to use that theme, thinking, and now trying to raise the ante on it, and using cybernetics to do so. So I use the word thinking when I wish to talk about my awareness of an unfolding or a churning, some process of a set of concepts and the connections among them. This is not the same as cognition. It is also not divorced from feeling or emotion. They go together, you can't separate them. They cannot not emotion. A way of thinking is a pattern. I use the term a way of thinking when I want to speak of a pattern of unfolding or churning and connecting of the concepts. Just as an aside, the metaphor unfolding and the metaphor churning come from a conversation I had once with Gordon Pass, who would like to talk about the two styles of thinking. One was stringing, he called it, sort of a sequential unfolding, and the other was chunking. So that's why the metaphor churning, it could be you could come up with other metaphors, and I'm sure there are other styles that could be added to this. But those are metaphors. So I have talked about cybernetics and use the word when I wish to speak of a way of thinking about ways of thinking, of which cybernetics is one. It's a self-referential description. A way of thinking about ways of thinking. The third item here on thinking I call deliberate thinking, and that is as opposed to improvised thinking, which I use when I wish to speak of a way of thinking as a choice. The way of thinking as a choice, not as a given, usually without awareness. When I use the word concept, I'm talking about something that is manifest in language. I use the word conversation when I wish to speak of particular dynamics of interaction among thinking participants in a language. It could be verbal, gestural, symbolic, etc. Many kinds of languages are possible. I've seen two mathematicians having a conversation in formal language. Didn't last very long, and they had to use a flip chart to write things on in order to do it, but I think I've seen that happen. This dynamic moves from an asynchronicity, the disagreement, the tension, the friction, being on different pages, being out of sync, moves from asynchronicity toward synchronicity. So thinking and language are built into this particular description of conversation. You can have conversations with others, clearly. Okay? In those conversations that I have with others, I can talk about us thinking together. We're perturbing each other, go back and forth. We keep doing it because we have a preference for recurrent interaction with others, at least for a while. I have a conversation with myself. I can't do that until I've had many conversations with others. It's something that's developmental. But once I have, and I understand that I can take on simultaneously different roles or different perspectives, I can set them up so that they have a conversation. And that I would call thinking as an individual. It's what generates my thinking, this experience that I talked about when I talked about my experience of thinking. And I postulate. Is it possible to talk about a conversation that an individual or a group can have with society? I'll put a question mark there because I'm not sure if this, if I'm using the word conversation here as a metaphor at this point, but it's something I'm interested in pursuing as a possibility. Something whereby new ways of thinking and new language emerge. So if I want to raise the ante in thinking, I want to raise it in language as well. And I also talk about cybernetics as offering a vocabulary for talking and hence thinking about the dynamics of relations and behavior. In this language, this vocabulary is, I'm stipulating, oppositional to or at least incompatible with our prevailing everyday language and ways of thinking. Is resisted, is expropriated, is diluted, and for those who might have been here the other day when I talked about my frustration with this vocabulary, that's the frustration. Frustration is not intended as a criticism. I have the language I have, and I have to use it, and we all have to use it, and everyone has to use it. But I now work to keep cybernetic opportunity from being expropriated and diluted. Hence, cybernetics is, as Klaus said the other day, revolutionary. It's revolutionary language. And it's going to be resisted. People ask me, what am I thinking about this prevailing way of language? What is it that I can identify, point to, that I don't want, that I'd like to see change? And so what I'm proposing here is 3 such prevailing concepts. Hierarchy as the predominant way of thinking about how we organize, how to organize the seemingly complex. Whether it's creating hierarchies in organizations, or creating categories. It's throughout science. It's throughout much of our lives every day. Goal-oriented purpose and achievement is the predominant way of thinking about what motivates behavior. And belief, where I'm using the word belief, and not in its sort of usual, I call it sort of sloppy way, where we just use it as a synonym for thinking, or I think, or I feel, I believe. But in the sense of what it invokes. The idea of belief and beliefs invokes some idea of truth. Or accepting something as permanent or ultimately true. And what I'm claiming here is its predominant way of thinking about what anchors us, humans, in the world we have, world of uncertainty, injustice, and oppression. And then finally, just some possible alternatives. Dialectical process, temporary structures, with a focus moving from structure to process. Where by dialectical process, I'm talking about that for every idea, create an opposing and/or incompatible idea. Every idea. Place the ideas in interaction to generate new ideas, and then create new opposing and incompatible ideas, and so on, the process. Desires as constraints. It's been a topic of some discussion. I've been trying to introduce the idea of desire as constraints into this language for the last, how many years? 40 years. Had become sort of comfortable with it, and then just the other night, Ben Sweeting, who had been, said he's not comfortable with it. So it requires me now to rethink. Okay, how do we think about our desires as constraints rather than as goals or objectives? And intention is an awareness of desires as a set of constraints. Essentially a consciousness of presence rather than the consciousness of purpose that Gregory Bateson was so concerned about. And finally, passions as angers rather than beliefs. Things that we feel so strongly about. It's going to take a lot to change them, but they can change because they're desires, they're not truths. Mine, for example, I talk about as participation dialogue. These are my passions. And they're passions that hold so strong it's going to take a lot to move them, but I don't take them as true. We'll take them as permanent. We had a good session in the play shop just recently, just before this set of sessions, in which the subject of language came up. It came up in the context of some things that Herbert Broom had written. Klaus, if you would, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments. By the way, Klaus was my teacher and mentor in graduate school. First person to introduce me to cybernetics, and the first person to encourage me to come to a conference. But others, like Herbert Broom, who had passed, who I had a chance to spend time with also, who had a great influence. Then there are others here in the room who keep me alert, keep me perturbed. Jude and Mark and Fred, who was also a student. Leonard put on a conference. These conferences, the reason that comes because they also really perturbed me in ways that I find interesting, sometimes frustrating. But Leonard put on a conference, a integration for the American Cybernetics. If you don't know what that is, you can ask her. But it left an impression on me of a possibility that I didn't know, hadn't thought of, and would now know having not gone through that process. So thanks. Maybe open it up for others. Yes.
Yeah, I think you're very much on the right track here. That in a world of increasing complexity, the average person looks at the world and says, "This is too complex. This is too crazy. I have to use my thought process to deal with this." And for too many people, it's simple violence is a great way to reduce the complexity of the world. We just kill a bunch of people, then everything will be a lot simpler. Especially my neighbor is now already gone. Oh, sorry. So my question for your thought process: would it be possible for a potential terrorist, let's say, for example, to follow your new way of thinking and still end up at the conclusion of, I think the best course of action is to do some violence to innocence?
Yeah, what I was going to mention about Herbert Broom was that he felt that the language, our everyday language, our prevailing language, whether it's English or almost any language worldwide, carries with it very violent tendencies. And so part of his project was to come up with, in the current language, because that's what we have, some statements, some proposals that played with the syntax of the language in such a way that it would maybe move in a different direction if someone took it up seriously. The way we talk about violence is one of those. I don't even know, it's hard to know where to start. But let me just say how I look at topic of violence and how it needs to be talked about maybe differently. Violence occurs every time that someone experiences a situation, whether they're in it or observing it, such that someone or some group is in a position where their only alternative left is violence. It's the only alternative. That's not the violence. The violence is putting people into that situation. And I add the third party as someone who can identify a situation as violent, because it may be that a victim doesn't feel, someone that dies, observer doesn't feel that they are being violated. Maybe that the perpetrator doesn't think that they're, doing something violent. But to me, observing this, I do. An example could be, I'm not sure it's a good example. People talk about the game of football, U.S. American football, as violent. I played football. I never, as a player, thought I was doing something or feeling and experiencing violence in any way. It was just a game. And there's contact, but it was a game, and that was it. But there are people, including one of my parents, who thought it was. And quite frankly, I've shifted my opinion to some as a third party now, somewhat since then, given some of the information that we now have about touches and so forth. And now I observe this, and I say, I'm not sure this is such a good. But anyway, thinking about violence in that way is a little different. Now, I also like to think that if we were to come as a world of humans, to some agreement about a desire that we might all have, maybe, or at least maybe a starting point is to say that people would prefer to live in a world where there isn't any violence. Now, I've come across people who won't say that. They tend to be people who are brought up in a culture of violence. This is something that they kind of part of their lives, some way or another. How they see themselves is how they define themselves, and they don't agree. But I like to think that the huge plurality of people, when asked the question, would you like to live in a world without violence, would say yes. I didn't answer your question, I know, because what I want to suggest is that the role of cybernetics can be, or could be, to move this language that's currently sustaining all of this in a new direction. And that cybernetics provides a way to do that. And that's what Herbert Bruin said. He said that his playing with syntax and language to come up with some very basic statements was an attempt using cybernetics to move the language to a new place. One comment on conversation. Conversation in this version that I have here, by the way, this dialectical process that happens in conversation. This version of conversation requires there to be conflict. If we want that conflict not to become violent, conversation is the response. For that to happen, the participants in a conversation have to be willing to be open, to be willing to change, to think, to adjust, to continue on, to respect, yes, to be generous. Otherwise, conflict can, as we know, easily turn into violence.
I was wondering about your use of the word belief. I don't know quite what you mean by it, but it sounds to me as though you mean a understanding of some state of the world which is liable to differ from somebody else. For instance, I believe that table is sufficiently solid to hold that cup up.
You think?
I believe that's the case. But
Well, I
that's not
don't.
what you
I don't. I accept it as temporarily the case. So that if something were to happen and that were to change, then it would no longer be the case.
I would not believe it if I saw it collapse. I believe it now.
Yeah, well, the problem isn't the problem with the word in that sense. The problem is that the word invokes something else.
Yes. Now, when you talked about thought, you said things about using language to do it.
Yeah.
I find that putting the thought into language is the very hardest thing. All my thinking almost is in pictures. It's in images which I don't know they're multi-dimensional pictures, but they are pictures. And language is very hard to
Yeah, natural language is difficult. It's much more robust than other language. The diagrams, visual languages, gestural languages, these all are important as well and possibilities.
I really liked, the title of the conference this year. And I was just wondering if you felt it made a difference to call it acting cybernetically and what you think about how much you want to contrast or integrate thinking and action.
The relation between thinking and acting is an important one, I think. I think this is where cybernetics has the most, or for me, it has the most to contribute. The thing we have to be careful about is that thinking often, and in our current language, our everyday language, is something you do and then you act. I'm looking for alternative ways of thinking where you think and act simultaneously. Whether it's in a conversation, or when you use language in a conversation, and that the conversation is the act that I'm interested in. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Larry. Thanks to everyone.
If you were not yet to understand the meaning which was conveyed to these events of sound, for it is believable that you do not yet believe in hearing the sound of events as they call on you to create the suitable language which might let you say to yourself that which is said to you just once and never again, for the first and the last time. There is no second time, since a language gained is a language lost, and to even try to tell you this seems a sheer waste of time, for it is language and thus lost.